what if some of the most impressive cathedrals built in the 1800s were not made by ordinary people but by giants? It sounds like something out of a legend or a story told to entertain. But the more you look at these massive structures, the harder it becomes to ignore the strange details hiding in plain sight. Details that don't quite match the version of history most of us learned. We're talking about buildings so large, so perfectly aligned, and so richly detailed that even today, with all our technology, they would be difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to recreate. Yet, we're told they were built using basic tools, manual labor, and techniques that seem far too simple for the results they achieved. When you stand in front of one of these cathedrals, the first thing you notice is the scale, doors that seem too tall, ceilings that stretch far beyond what feels necessary, and stone blocks so massive that just imagining how they were lifted into place raises more questions than answers. And then come the details, carvings repeated with near-perfect precision, patterns that follow complex geometry, and structures that feel less like they were slowly built, and more like they were placed as if someone already knew exactly how everything should fit together. Official history tells us these were the result of human effort, years of work, and incredible dedication. But there's something about that explanation that feels incomplete when you really start paying attention. Because if everything we see doesn't fully match the story we've been told, then it opens the door to a much bigger question. Is it possible that these cathedrals were designed for a different kind of builder, or even built by beings much larger than us? Before jumping to any conclusion about giants or unknown builders, it's important to slow down and really look at what these cathedrals actually are. Because the mystery doesn't begin with theories, it begins with what is physically right in front of us. Across Europe, especially in countries like France, Germany, and England, there are cathedrals from the 1800s that follow a very similar pattern. Enormous stone structures, extremely tall doors and windows, ceilings that seem to stretch far beyond what is practical, and an overall scale that feels almost exaggerated when compared to the average human body. When you approach one of these buildings, the entrance alone can feel overwhelming, with doors that are several times taller than a person, framed by thick stone columns and heavy arches, as if they were designed for something much larger to pass through comfortably. Inside, that feeling only increases, because the ceilings rise to heights that are difficult to even process visually, supported by columns that look more like pillars for something gigantic rather than supports for human-scale architecture. And the space itself feels almost too large for its intended purpose. Then there are the stone blocks, some of them weighing several tons, cut with a level of precision that allows them to fit together almost perfectly, without visible gaps, without uneven edges, and without the kind of irregularities you would expect from manual carving using basic tools. Even more interesting are the repeating patterns. Decorative elements that appear again and again across walls, ceilings, and columns, maintaining a consistency that suggests a level of control and replication that seems advanced for the time, especially when you consider that each piece was supposedly crafted by hand. And when all of this is combined, the scale, the precision, the repetition, and the overall harmony of the structure, it creates a feeling that is hard to ignore. A sense that these buildings were not just constructed, but executed with a level of planning and capability that doesn't fully match the simple explanation of manual labor alone. At this point, we're not saying anything about giants yet. We're just observing, just looking at what exists and asking a basic question that anyone can understand. Do these structures truly look like they were built only with the tools and methods we're told were available at the time? Or is there something about them that suggests a different story, one that hasn't been fully explained? Now that we've looked at the structures themselves, the next step is to compare what we see with the official historical record, because this is where things start to become even more interesting and in some cases difficult to ignore. According to mainstream history, many of these cathedrals were either built or heavily reconstructed during the 1800s, a period when tools were still relatively basic. Construction relied heavily on manual labor, and large-scale engineering projects required enormous amounts of time, coordination, and documentation. But when you start searching for detailed records of how these cathedrals were actually built, step by step, who moved the stones, how they were lifted, how long each phase took, you often find something surprising. The information is either very limited, overly simplified, or in some cases, almost completely absent. We're told that thousands of workers were involved, that scaffolding was used, that materials were transported over long distances. But clear, detailed explanations of the exact methods are rarely presented in a way that fully matches the complexity of what we see in the finished structures. Even more curious is the timeline, because some of these massive projects appear to have been completed, or at least significantly advanced, within timeframes that feel unusually short when compared to the scale of the work involved, especially when we consider the limitations of transportation, communication, and technology at the time. There are also cases where cathedrals are described as restorations, but when you look closely, the level of work done goes far beyond simple repair, involving entire sections rebuilt with incredible precision, as if the builders already had a complete understanding of the final design, without the trial and error process we would normally expect. And then there's the lack of visual documentation, because for an era that already had access to early photography, we might expect to see more images of these constructions in progress, more evidence of the stages, the tools, the challenges. Yet, what we find is often limited, selective, or focused only on certain moments. When you put all of this together, the gaps in documentation, the simplified explanations, the ambitious timelines, it doesn't necessarily prove anything by itself, but it does create a pattern that suggests that the full story of how these cathedrals were built may not be as complete as we've been led to believe. And once you start noticing those gaps, it naturally leads to a bigger question. If the official explanations don't fully account for what we see, then what else could explain it? Once the gaps in the official story become visible, even if they don't prove anything on their own, they create space for alternative explanations to enter the conversation, and among all the theories that try to fill those gaps, one of the most provocative and at the same time one of the oldest is the idea of giants. This isn't a new concept, because stories of giant beings appear in cultures all around the world, from ancient texts to local legends, often describing individuals or entire groups much larger than normal humans, with strength and abilities that would make tasks like moving massive stones seem far less impossible. When you bring that idea back to these cathedrals, certain details start to look different, not as definitive proof, but as curious coincidences that are difficult to ignore once you've considered the possibility. For example, the scale of doors and entrances, which often seem oversized even for large crowds, could make more sense if they were designed with larger proportions in mind, or at least inspired by builders who were used to working at a different scale. The massive stone blocks, some weighing several tons, raise another question. Because while it is technically possible for groups of humans to move such weights using levers, ramps, and time, the level of precision required to place them perfectly, repeatedly, and at great heights would become significantly easier if the builders themselves had greater physical strength or size. Then there's the verticality of these structures. Ceilings that reach heights far beyond practical necessity, supported by columns that seem almost excessive. Unless the design was influenced by a perspective where such scale felt natural rather than exaggerated. Even the decorative elements can be viewed through a different lens, because patterns that seem intricate and repetitive at our scale might have been simpler and more intuitive for someone working at a larger physical size. Of course, none of this confirms that giants actually built these cathedrals, and it's important to keep that clear. Because what we're exploring here is not a proven conclusion, but a way of looking at the same evidence from a different angle. But the reason this theory continues to appear again and again is because it offers a simple answer to a complex problem. If the builders were bigger, stronger, or operating at a different level than modern humans, then many of the challenges we struggle to explain today would suddenly become much easier to understand. And that leads us to a critical point in this investigation. If the idea of giants helps explain some of these mysteries, the next question is not just whether they could have existed, but whether there is any real evidence that they did. At this point, the idea of giants may feel intriguing, maybe even convincing in some aspects, but everything now depends on one key question. Is there any real, concrete evidence that beings of that scale actually existed, or are we simply connecting dots in a way that feels satisfying, but may not reflect reality? Throughout history, there have been reports, discoveries, and even photographs claiming to show unusually large human skeletons, findings that, if true, would completely change our understanding of human history and make theories like this much harder to dismiss. Some of these reports date back to the 1800s and early 1900s, describing excavations where oversized bones were allegedly found buried underground, sometimes alongside tools or objects that suggested an advanced or at least organized culture. There are also old newspaper articles and accounts that mention these discoveries in a matter-of-fact way, as if they were simply documenting something unusual but real, without the tone of fiction or exaggeration we might expect. However, when researchers try to track down these findings today, many of them seem to have disappeared. The bones are no longer available. The locations are unclear, and in many cases, the only evidence that remains are the written reports or images that are difficult to verify. Mainstream science offers a different explanation, suggesting that many of these so-called giant skeletons were either misidentified fossils, exaggeration, or even hoaxes created during a time when sensational discoveries could easily capture public attention without the level of verification we expect today. There's also the argument that human biology places limits on size, because as height increases, the strain on bones, joints, and the cardiovascular system becomes much greater, making it difficult for extremely large human-like beings to exist and function in the way these theories suggest. So on one side, we have stories, reports, and intriguing fragments of possible evidence, and on the other, we have scientific reasoning and the lack of verifiable physical proof. And right here is where the line becomes clear, because believing that giants built these cathedrals requires more than just noticing unusual architecture. It requires accepting that an entire category of beings existed, left traces behind, and then somehow disappeared without leaving solid, undeniable evidence, which brings us to the final and most important part of this investigation. If giants are not the answer, then what is? After looking at the scale of these cathedrals, the precision of their construction, the gaps in historikerets and teories that explain, but seem to fit, we arrive at a point where the mystery is no longer just about buildings, it becomes something much bigger than that. Because in the end, this isn't only about whether giants existed or not. It's about how much of our past we truly understand and how much of it may still be incomplete, simplified, or even misunderstood. The official explanations tell us that these structures are the result of human effort, intelligence, and time, and in many ways. That may very well be true, but at the same time, the questions we've explored throughout this video don't simply disappear. The scale is still there. The precision is still there. The missing details in the construction process are still there, quietly waiting for better answers, or at least more complete ones. And the idea of giants, whether taken literally or as a symbolic way of describing something beyond our current understanding, continues to return for one simple reason. It tries to explain what doesn't yet feel fully explained. So now the question is no longer what history says. The real question is what you see. When you look at these cathedrals with their impossible size, their perfect geometry, and their mysterious origins, do you truly believe they were built exactly the way we've been told? Or is there something more behind them that we still haven't uncovered?